Okay, well, Stefan, I just want to say thank you very much for taking the time out to join me on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
Good. And just for the listeners that may not have heard of you before, could you just give us a brief introduction of who you are and what it is you do?
Sure. So I have an undergrad degree in biochemistry, a PhD in neurobiology, and I used that neurobiology degree to study the neuroscience of obesity as a postdoc, and essentially trying to understand the ways in which the brain regulates eating behavior and body fatness, but primarily body fatness was my research. But my interests are much broader than that. And after being part of that field for a while and learning more about it and finding it really interesting and finding that many people in the public they hadn't really encountered a lot of this information that we kind of took for granted in the scientific community, I decided to write a book, The Hungry Brain. And so that's kind of my encapsulation of some of my primary ideas about uh, the regulation of eating behavior and obesity and what causes people to gain excess fat. And yeah, and then the presentation that I gave to Mac Nutrition recently that you attended, that was all about um, both the determinants of calorie intake and also the physiological effects of calorie intake in terms of insulin resistance and chronic diseases related to it. So I'm not actually a researcher anymore in the sense of doing like laboratory experiments. Basically, now I do a few different things related to research, but mostly research analysis. And but yeah, I still am very interested in obesity and regulation of eating behavior and body fatness. And that's still something that I write about and speak about pretty frequently.
Yeah, I mean, and fantastic because it's amazing as you just said there. The writing of the Hungry Brain for you, as you said, was taking all of this data that a lot of the scientists out there probably took for granted to try and communicate to the public. But it's almost as if the book was behind the curve in terms of the information era, in because we still have so many debates around why we are getting increasingly overweight and unhealthy.
Yeah, and I think, some of those debates are legitimate. Some of them are just born of ignorance or bias or whatever. Um, but I think, there's one basic fact that a lot of people, I think on one level, like if you explain it to them, they understand and it makes sense to them, but no one really thinks about it, which is the fact that the brain generates all behavior. And so obviously any eating behaviors that we engage in, whether it's the decision to eat food, how much we eat, what we choose to eat, all of those things are coming from brain activity. And so understanding brain activity is obviously something that we should be doing if we're trying to understand eating behavior. Understanding brain activity, what the systems are that underlie it, and what the cues are both inside and outside the body that impact it.
Mm. Yeah, and that is exactly what I want to talk about today, because I think for the listeners out there, it's both the knowledge of what happens and why, because at least then they can understand that and then have a better hope in actioning against it. And I mean, I guess really we just have to clarify with that first point then in terms of what is this biggest driver of obesity right now? Like, why are we in pretty much the worst epidemic we've been in?
Yeah, so there are different ways to look at this, all the way from the simple to the complex. And I'll start with the simple. Um, Essentially, the only way that you can accumulate fat mass in your body, which, fat mass is an energy storage site, essentially, fat tissue is the primary energy storage site of the body. The only way to accumulate excess fat mass is to take in more calories than you're expending. So we know right from the beginning that we are over consuming calories relative to our calorie needs. And so then the question becomes, why are we doing that? And we know from at least three different sources of evidence in the United States that our calorie intake has increased over time. And the most accurate estimate that we have suggests that calorie intake has increased by about 218 calories per day on average in the United States. So it won't be exactly the same in all countries, but I think all affluent countries are qualitatively similar in the sense that their body fatness is increasing and probably their calorie intake is increasing, or at least calorie intake relative to needs is increasing. So essentially, I think what has happened is that we've had a massive shift in our food environment and in the types of foods that we're surrounded by. So, one of the kind of high level trends that I like to focus on is the shift from home cooking to processed food consumption. So, or I should say commercially prepared food consumption is what I really mean. So if you look back in the United States, if we go back 130 years ago to, just before the turn of the century, almost all of the food that people consumed was ingredients that they bought at a store and then prepared, or maybe they grew it on their farm and then they prepared it in their own kitchen. Whereas today, most of the foods that we eat, either they are prepared restaurant foods that we're eating outside of the home, or they are prepared foods that we're buying in a grocery store and bringing home and just reheating and eating. So we have this very, very different food environment where we have this massive increase in convenience, massive decrease in food costs. The composition of the food that we're eating is different and more oriented. It's a better reflection of what the brain's innate preferences are in terms of the basic drives that get us to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And we're surrounded by it. We're surrounded by food cues all the time. And so I think those things together make it very easy to overconsume. And then, there are other things too. Like if you go back to the late 1800s, people were a lot more physically active. So 70+% of jobs were manual labor jobs, at least in the United States. I'm sure it was the same in many countries. And so what you see back then is that their calorie intake was actually, we don't have great estimates, but from what little we know, their calorie intake was actually about the same as ours today in the United States, but there was no obesity epidemic because they needed those calories to do the work that they were doing.
Mm.
And what you see is that as jobs became more sedentary through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, calorie intake actually declined in the United States. And then eventually it bounced back up as our food environment basically shifted to a more fattening environment. Another thing I'll mention is that cigarette smoking declined around the same time that we began getting fatter more rapidly in the United States. Mm-hmm. And that may account for some of it. Cigarette smoking, most people know cigarette smoking makes you leaner. And cigarettes per capita has dropped by about 3/4 in the United States since the 1970s. Mm-hmm. And if you overlay the curve of the decline in cigarette smoking and the increase in obesity, it's like a perfect match. So I'm not saying that explains all of it. It certainly doesn't, but yeah, it's probably a factor.
It's interesting associative data, isn't it? As you said, it's interesting correlation to make, especially as probably a lot of people would say that smoking is a bit of an appetite suppressant for them. And you do see people who quit smoking and then put on weight because it's almost the habit of putting something in their mouth, as well as that stress relief that it brings them as well, which they then probably turn to food for instead.
Well, also, I mean, nicotine actually acts on hunger circuits. It acts directly on hunger circuits in the brain.
Yeah.
So it's, So it has effects that suppress food intake and body weight. And then when you remove that, you see pretty consistently in studies that at least on average, people gain a fair amount of weight. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, in the year or two after people quit, their risk of developing diabetes goes up quite a bit temporarily because of
food intake.
Yeah, because of their food intake and their increase in weight. Of course, on net, it's still really good for their health to quit. Yeah. So I don't want to give anybody the wrong impression. It's like the worst possible thing you could do for your health is to smoke. But just an interesting interesting concept that I think plays into it.
Definitely, yeah, and I'm glad you finished with that point, because of no point I want to encourage people to pick that back up. But it was quite interesting, and you brought this up at the Mac Nutrition event about the decline in smoking was pretty much because the environment became a lot harder, and how because it became banned in public places and much more shunned within society because of the emerging research. It became a lot harder to do, and people just gave up because of that. And you were saying it's almost similar to what we need to do with fast food.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. So if you look at the decline in cigarette smoking in the United States, it's been something like 70% decline in per capita cigarette consumption. It's probably pretty similar in a lot of European countries. And basically, I can't speak to other countries, but in the United States, the reason that happened is that we had these, or at least a reason it happened, is we had these giant tobacco company settlements where they had basically lied and tried to suppress the research. They got sued, and it turned into this, multi-billion-dollar settlement that then funded anti-tobacco efforts. And that turned into a lot of advocacy happening. So you had a variety of things happening. One is that cigarettes became more expensive, so the taxes went up and up and up. I remember when I was a kid, I mean, there's inflation to factor in as well. Unfortunately, I can't correct for inflation in my head, but when I was a kid, a pack of cigarettes was $1 here in the United States. And today it's like $12 in the place where I live. So even correcting for inflation, there's been a massive increase in the cost of cigarettes. So they've become more costly. They have become less convenient. There's so many places you can't smoke now. You can't smoke in the bar. You can't smoke in a restaurant. You can't smoke on an airplane. When I was a kid, you could smoke on airplanes.
Yeah, yeah.
Everybody was just smoking on the airplane. It's pretty crazy to think about now, but that's how it was. And yeah, so it's become less convenient. It's become more expensive, and there's a stigma against it now. So there's, in the same way, so the concept here I'm referring to in part is called counter marketing. So in marketing, if you're like a Coca-Cola executive, you're trying to sell people sugar water, right? Like there's not really, like you can't talk about the quality of the product, or there's not really anything you can say to like rationally get people to buy it. The only thing that you can do is to show them images of like cool, sexy people having fun and drinking that, and just try to create these positive associations in people's brains, right? So what they did in the United States is the reverse. They did counter marketing, where they were trying to associate cigarettes with bad things. So they would have, commercials on TV with somebody with a tracheotomy who is, like speaking through, I forget what it's called, but a voice box.
Yeah.
And, show a pair of lungs from a person who's a longtime smoker, and they're like black and shriveled up, and et cetera, et cetera. So basically trying to get people to associate those things with bad feelings, not good feelings, like advertising would normally do. And, we like to think that we can't be manipulated, but it's a lie. We can be manipulated, very subtly. And those types of things shift our perceptions, and they shift the culture. And so now, like culturally, at least in the United States, people of my generation find cigarette smoking kind of gross. It's not really something that's socially acceptable anymore. And so I think that those things came together to have a profound effect on tobacco consumption, and it ended up being a huge public health win. I mean, enormous. So, and I think at the end of the day, I don't think we should necessarily ban cigarettes. I think if people want to choose to do that, that's their choice. But I think people should understand the risks, and I don't think that it should be necessarily easy to allow that to be the default behavior in society. And I think, depending on your beliefs about food, I think we could apply many of those same strategies to certain types of foods that almost everyone agrees are not good for you. Nobody thinks that cakes and pastries and cookies are good for you. Not very many people think that, processed meats are good for you. So is there a line that we can draw where most people agree these things are not good, and we have some kind of effort that's similar to what we did with tobacco?
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether or not we should do that, whether or not it's ethical to do that, that's up to people to decide. It's up to countries to decide. But I think that if we chose to do that, it would probably be at least somewhat effective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree with you, and I'm glad you kind of brought it back toward food, because obviously we went off a bit of a tangent around cigarettes, but the point remains the same as you talked about the marketing efforts, because as you said now, and you said it earlier on as well, of the food cues in our environments, and the UK are very similar to the US in that regard, in that we have many of the same fast food chains, and we now have food delivery services as well, and as you said, it was the average person sees 20 odd cues a day, is it, for food of that nature, through either adverts on the telly, radio, billboards, and it's that constant reminder of those foods. And as you said, the people eating these foods aren't in a hospital bed dying of a heart attack. They're out with their mates having a great time, or really happy, healthy people. And they then have this association of, you eat this food and you're going to feel better.
Yeah. And it just, you get these positive associations. Yeah. Obviously, like the person advertising beer in the billboard doesn't have a beer belly.
Yeah.
They're like fit, young, beautiful people.
Mm-hmm.
Even though if you drink too much of that, you probably will end up with not looking like those people in the ad.
Yeah.
But anyway, I mean, it reminds the brain that those foods are available, and that triggers the motivation to eat those foods. This is a very basic Pavlovian response in the human brain.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to, I talked about this a little bit in the
go ahead.
presentation. I'm just going to review this very simple experiment that Ivan Pavlov did that probably a lot of people have heard of. He took dogs, and he noticed that when he brought food in for his dogs, they would salivate and they would get excited for that food. Many people who have dogs have noticed something similar. And what he found was that if he then if he just rang a bell, nothing really happened. The dogs didn't salivate. They didn't get excited. It was a meaningless sensory stimulus to them. But then if he repeatedly rang that bell every time he brought them food, eventually they came to associate the sound of the bell with the food, and then he could just ring the bell and they would start to salivate and they would get excited, because their brains knew on a very deep instinctual level, so deep that it was actually controlling their digestive physiology, right? That's the salivation. Their brains knew on a very deep instinctive level that food was coming when they heard that bell, because it had made that association. And this is exactly the way that the human brain works. So, and it's not just the human brain, this is the brain of all animals. When you eat food, essentially dopamine gets released in your brain, and your brain remembers all the things that were associated with that food, all the sensory cues, like the smell of it, the taste of it, the appearance of it, where you were, what the context was. All of those things get stamped into your brain as being associated with all these great calories that you just got in your belly. And the more the calories and the tastier the food, the more they get stamped in as a motivational cue. And so the next time you smell those brownies in the oven, the cookies in the oven, or you smell the pizza, or you see the pizza or the chips or whatever it is, that's like Pavlov ringing the bell. That's the cue. That is the sensory cue. Just like the bell is the sensory cue that reminds the dog there's food, the smell, the sight, the situation, the context, that is the sensory cue for you that reminds you that food is available. And so that triggers all of those things in your brain, just like in those dogs. Maybe you'll start to salivate. Probably if you could measure it, you probably would be salivating more. You probably start to salivate. You certainly will experience a motivational state. You may feel a craving. You may feel hungry all of a sudden. And that's because those cues have basically told your brain, hey, this is a situation where you can get this amazing, truckload of calories into your belly.
Yeah.
And we knew what happened last time you did this. It was awesome. So let's do it again. That's what your brain is saying on a very instinctive, deep level.
Yeah.
And so when you have these billboards all over the place, or you're watching television and you see these ads, that's what your brain is doing. And on some level, it is activating those motivational circuits that are saying, hey, this food is available, let's eat it.
Yeah.
And you may not even be very aware of that. Like, obviously, every time you see an image of like fish and chips on the TV, you don't go out and buy fish and chips. But I think on some level, it does increase the probability that you will do that or something like it. And in fact, it has to, because if it didn't, why would these companies spend billions of dollars putting those images in front of you?
Yeah, and I think if you analysed ad placement on television in terms of times of day, you'd probably find that more adverts for fast food and food deliveries would be on in the evening when people are prime time and watching the telly at that point, which is probably, habits come into it for sure in terms of nighttime snacking. But 100% it'll be down to the adverts that appear on the TV. The fact that, Uber Eats is out there in the States, right?
Yeah.
We have that as well as Deliveroo. I'm not sure if that's over in the US. So you've got and Just Eat and a million different ways to order food online and get the guy to throw the pizza through your window. So do you know what I mean? We're so close to that Wall-E picture of man where we're all just sat in recliners scooting around this galactic universe with virtual reality headsets. It's quite scary.
Yeah.
But I'm obviously talking of this from someone who's heard you speak and read your book, and so we talked about the cause of obesity being the whole, you're taking in too many calories, unfortunately, and that's a combination of the environment we're in and the fact we don't move as much anymore. And now we have this food environment which is constantly driving us to these types of foods because of these cues. But you spoke then about the body saying, yeah, you're going to get a ton of calories here and it's going to be awesome. So for those that haven't read the book, talk about why that is. Why do we have this innate attraction to high calorie foods?
Yeah. So basically, energy is really important for survival and reproduction in the wild. So if you're a wild animal and you can't get enough energy, you're done. You're either dead or you're not going to reproduce effectively. And reproductive success is the currency of natural selection that drives adaptation. So essentially, most of the traits that we have are things that suited our ancestors in the ancestral environment a long time ago. And so you have what you see over time is the evolution of brain systems that are good at getting energy into the body, right? You have brain systems that are good at generating behaviors that effectively obtain energy for the organism. And so our ancestors, if you look at, you can do this in a variety of species, including humans. If you look at foraging patterns, you can actually model those quantitatively. So you can actually derive equations that reasonably accurately predict foraging behavior just based on the energy return rate of those foraging behaviors. So in other words, the value of a particular food item is equal to the number of calories in that item minus the number of calories you have to burn to get it divided by time. That's just the calorie return rate. It's the same really basic equation that you would use to think about your financial investments. It comes from economics. So basically, the more calories you can obtain per unit time, the more motivated you should be to get that food. And this is this really basic principle that's wired into the human brain. And again, if you look at human hunter-gatherer foraging behavior, and of course, hunter-gatherers are quote unquote wild humans that, are in the environment that we were in for the vast majority of our existence. If you look at their behavior, it can be predicted fairly well using this equation. And that's true for many species. Now, of course, they're not, hunter-gatherers and all these species, they're not doing math in their head explicitly. They don't know how to do math. They don't understand economics. but the brain is just set up to implicitly perform this calculation, to implicitly optimize for this property.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's basically, we are really good at getting energy. And that served us really well in the ancestral environment. And you see hunter gatherers, they don't hold back around food. They don't have stigma around overeating. To them, the more you can eat, the better, because they are always struggling to get enough food.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like they're starving. I don't want to give you the impression that they're just like walking around, skeletons, always hungry.
Mm-hmm.
Usually they're pretty healthy and robust, but they're always kind of on the verge of not getting enough. And so whenever they can get a windfall and a bunch of food, they take advantage of it. And they don't call it gluttony. They don't stigmatize it. That is a good thing for them. It helps them survive and reproduce. And so that is how their brains are wired. That is how our brains are wired. And in the modern world, we still have those drives to acquire energy, and those express themselves via hunger. They express themselves via cravings. Our drives to conserve energy express themselves via a reluctance to do physical activity that's unnecessary. And so these things in our brain are still there. I mean, think about, like, if you have a really tasty, unhealthy food in front of you, you have to motivate yourself to not eat that food, right? Your intrinsic impulse is to eat that food. Whereas for most people, if you want to go to the gym and work out, you have to motivate yourself to go to the gym.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to motivate yourself to not go to the gym. You have to motivate yourself to go to the gym. So your intrinsic impulse is the opposite there. It's to conserve energy. And so basically all of our impulses, at least for the average person, are there to get more energy into the body and let less energy leave the body.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what our ancestors needed. But today we're just swimming in so much food. We have basically just removed the constraints on calorie intake through technology and affluence.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways it's amazing. Like, we're, in affluent countries, we're not starving anymore. Our food system is extremely reliable and abundant and cheap. So it's like, you can't say it's all a bad thing, but it does come with costs.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those costs is that it just doesn't play well with the human systems in our brains for regulating energy intake and body fatness. Those systems have a level of motivational drive to consume calories that is mismatched. It's miscalibrated with the modern environment, where it's very easy to obtain those things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of I think that's kind of the basic situation we're in terms of overconsumption.
Yeah. And I think it's good that you talked about it in that level of detail, because it can be something that people can really just disregard without giving it a second thought, because they say, well, we're not in that situation anymore, so why would that be the case? But as you said, we've evolved from thousands and thousands of years, and it's therefore innate within us to have these drives, which we're unable to override as much in the situation we're in now.
Yeah, that's right. And let me just add that that's what my book focuses on, is these non-conscious brain circuits and how they influence us. These circuits are, by definition, because they're non-conscious, by definition, we're not really aware of what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't really think about the fact that they're guiding our behavior. But, like, where does hunger come from? Where does a craving come from? You don't choose to have those. Those are things that bubble up from non-conscious brain systems. So I think if we want to understand our drives and our impulses and our behaviors, we have to understand those systems that we don't have direct conscious access to.
Yeah, because at least with greater understanding of them, as you said, we can't control them to an extent, but at least we'll know why they're there, and potentially then be able to consciously choose something else, or understand. Because I guess a lot of people talk about addiction to certain foods, and really you could probably boil it down to that craving effect, that hunger effect, especially as people lose weight.
Yeah, and you can't control those brain circuits. By definition, they're non-conscious, so we can't directly control them, but we can influence their activity.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing about these circuits is they respond to the inputs they're given. So they're kind of simple in that way. They're not, like our higher order processing in our brain that makes us intelligent, that makes us conscious, is very flexible. It can respond in flexible and unpredictable ways to almost any situation. But these non-conscious brain systems, they're just like input output functions. I mean, they can learn over time, but generally it's pretty simple. It's like smell pizza, feel craving.
Yeah.
So, but that's a scenario that you can modify, right? By not smelling the pizza. So if you don't smell the pizza, you don't experience the craving.
Yeah.
And so so we can modify the activity of those circuits by changing the cues that we're giving them, both the cues that they're paying attention to that are coming from inside our bodies and the cues that are coming from our external environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it comes down to doing what you can to modify your environment as much as possible. As you said there, like not having those foods in the house per se, or not putting yourself in a position where you want those foods as often. Controlling the adverts on the TV is something that's pretty much out of our control, apart from to not watch them, to walk around blindfolded. So obviously there has to be some adaptations to the environment we're in, I guess. With the people listening, I obviously know that and you talked about it just there, it's this overconsumption of calories which is causing the epidemic. And I'd mentioned briefly about addiction to food. And so what do you talk to people about who say, and I know you've talked about this on other podcasts, you're probably blue in the face about it, but the whole carbohydrate, sugar, insulin hypothesis of obesity. I just want you to go into it a little bit more detail, especially for a lot of people who will be listening to this podcast. They'll probably have come from low carb, paleo type debates, and probably still have, Gary Taubes in their mind with these kind of arguments.
Yeah. So just to define it, this is the idea that obesity is caused by consumption of carbohydrate, which increases circulating levels of insulin, which acts on fat cells to trap fat and tells tissues to take glucose out of the bloodstream. And then once fat and glucose are low, we get hungry. And so basically this insulin-driven fattening process results in increased hunger. It results in decreased desire for physical activity, and it results in fat gain. So I think there are a couple of critical concepts here that I want to highlight. One is that according to this model, insulin is the central cause of obesity physiologically. And according to this model, increases in calorie intake are downstream of the fattening process. So the higher calorie intake does not cause people to gain fat, according to this model. It's actually the fat gain that is causing people to eat more. And so, although a lot of proponents of this model, like Gary Taubes, they won't even acknowledge that people with obesity eat more. They will argue that they do not.
Yeah.
Which is incorrect, but that is a position that they hold. And so, yeah, so, and a lot of people hear this model and they're like, oh, this is so cool and interesting and new and edgy. And it's like, I think a lot of people just kind of enjoy it on that basis, but it really is not consistent with the scientific evidence that we have. And I mean, some of it is just really, really basic stuff. Like if obviously, if you think that carbohydrate and insulin are the primary drivers of fat gain and calorie intake doesn't really matter, this is the position. I'm not caricaturing at all. This is literally what Gary Taubes believes. I don't want to pick on him individually. I've done that enough, but I'm just using him as an example because he's the primary person who holds this idea and promotes it publicly. If that were true, then if you feed people the same number of calories of fat versus carbohydrate, you should see that the people eating the carbohydrate gain weight. The people eating the fat don't gain weight, right? The carbohydrate stimulates insulin, and that should cause fat gain independently of the number of calories they eat. But what you actually see, I mean, this experiment has been done many times. It's been meta-analyzed. I think there are 20 studies at this point that have fed carbs versus fat with the same amount of calories, same amount of protein under tightly controlled conditions where people couldn't cheat. The researchers were providing all the food. They were measuring everything accurately. So really tightly controlled conditions. I think this experiment has been done 20 times now, and it's been meta-analyzed. And what they find is that the amount of carbohydrate versus fat makes very little difference. Basically, the number of calories is the dominant predictor of fat mass changes. And in fact, the small difference that there actually was a statistically significant difference of carb versus fat in this meta-analysis, but it actually favored carbohydrate. So people, calorie for calorie, according to this meta-analysis, carbohydrate was slightly less fattening than fat.
Yeah.
And so, but I mean, the difference is negligible. It's not really something that is gonna, like, if you're relying on that to cause a meaningful difference in fat mass, you're going to be disappointed. It's very small. But I mean, the point is that this is just obviously and flatly incompatible with the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. I mean, this is the point at which any rational person says, okay, let's find a new hypothesis. But there are many other reasons why the hypothesis fails. I mean, if I were, doing research on this and I was trying to evaluate this hypothesis, the first thing I would do, the very first experiment I would do, is I would say, do people with higher insulin levels gain more weight over time than people with lower insulin levels? And that has been done many, many times because there are tons of studies that have measured insulin level and then measured weight change over time. And what they find is that you can't predict who's going to gain weight and who's not based on insulin. It doesn't have any predictive value. People with very high insulin do not, on average, gain more weight than people with low insulin. It doesn't, there's no correlation there. So you can't, that is not compatible with the idea that insulin is the primary driver of fat gain. Now, there could be, confounders and whatever, and maybe it could play some role. I could see that. But if you believe that is the dominant cause of fat gain, that is the primary cause of fat gain, there has to be a correlation or else your hypothesis is done. And so that's just two pieces right there that I think are two of the simplest ways to explain why it doesn't work. But, actually one other piece I'll throw in there is that there are so many cultures all around the world that eat high carbohydrate diets and are lean. And some of these cultures, they're not all eating they're not eating brown rice and kale salads. They're eating, some of them, higher glycemic carbohydrates in very large amounts, not eating very much fat, not eating very much animal foods, and they're lean. And that's what you see in pretty much all traditional cultures, regardless of whether the diet is focused on carbohydrate or whether it's more focused on fat. They don't have obesity. And so there's just all of these really simple basic observations that for me make it kind of a head scratcher why anyone would believe this hypothesis. That said, I mean, I think the greatest strength of the hypothesis is basically that people lose weight when they eat a low carbohydrate diet.
Of course.
And so, if you're someone who has done that, where you've had success with a low carbohydrate diet, where it's helped to control your appetite and it has helped you lose weight, and then you read a book by, Gary Taubes or somebody else who holds those ideas, you're going to have a tendency to believe everything he says because he has confirmed this thing that you experienced. And I think that explains a lot of the belief, is that basically, this diet that he recommended helped me, and therefore he must be right about everything he says. I think is kind of the attitude that I see a lot. That's actually the most common objection I get when I point out the issues with the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. People say, well, I lost weight. And essentially, yeah, people do lose weight on low carbohydrate diets. And I think it is a useful tool in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't necessarily, there are other ways to explain that
Mm-hmm.
than insulin.
Yeah.
And let me just really quick add that I'm less confident. I'm fairly confident. I'm quite confident that insulin is not the primary driver of fat gain. So it's not the primary cause of obesity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm less confident about its role in weight loss. So I don't think it's the primary driver there, but I'm less confident about that than I am about it not being the primary cause of obesity.
Right. Okay. Do you mean in its role with people losing weight, in how easy they find it, or in how hard they find it to keep off?
Um, I would say both, although I think the former is better characterized
Mm-hmm.
than the latter. So, if you compare low fat and low carbohydrate diets and their ability to cause weight loss, they
Mm-hmm.
both cause weight loss. They both get people to spontaneously eat less, even if there's no deliberate calorie restriction imposed.
Mm-hmm.
People just spontaneously eat less and they lose weight. Um, However, you will see at least out to 6 months or so. Generally, in most studies, there's an advantage for the low carbohydrate diet.
Mm-hmm.
So people will tend to lose more weight. Their calorie intake will tend to go down more. And so, does the reduction in insulin play some role, or does something about the change in insulin signaling play some role in the difference between those two? The
Mm-hmm.
fact that there is this modest advantage for low carbohydrate diets. I'm not really aware of good evidence that it does, but I'm also not aware of really clear evidence that it does not.
Yeah.
And so it's just not something that I want to rule out at this point. I don't want to be overconfident and say this can't play any role.
Yeah. Yeah. It's more of a case of just going against the direct hypothesis of causing obesity in the first place, as you said. And there is interesting research which needs to be further done around people's individual sensitivity to insulin, doesn't it? And their then success on either a low fat, low carb diet. I think there was one study I learned about where they did stratify people by that, and they found that some people worked better on a low carb and other people worked better on a low fat, and that was dependent on how insulin sensitive they were, which would be entirely genetic. And so that's definitely something that warrants further research, because if we can pinpoint that in everyone, then it would probably help people then decide what diet was best for them long term.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would love to see more research on that. And I think there are undoubtedly factors, genetic and otherwise, that will make some people respond better to some diets than others.
Definitely.
I interact with a lot of people who say like, hey, I tried a low fat diet and it didn't work for me. I gained weight, and then I tried low carb and weight loss was so effortless.
Mm-hmm.
And then I get other people saying the opposite to me. I get
Yeah.
emails like this all the time from people who say, I went on a low carb diet and I started gaining weight, and I just stuck with it because I was convinced that it was the only effective method.
Mm-hmm.
Then I finally switched to a low fat diet, higher carbohydrate, and the weight came back off, and now I'm leaner. So I get emails like that all the time too. So
Yeah.
I think it really is quite individual. Um, that said, I don't want to equate all diets and say that all diets are equally effective on average. I think I certainly don't start from that assumption, but I will say that, this idea of insulin sensitivity being a major determinant of how people do on different diets, there has been certainly some research that suggests that it does matter, but the largest and most rigorous study done to date, which is the Diet Fit study, was not able to confirm that hypothesis.
Right. Okay.
Um, and so whether it was the diet context, the specific diets they had people on, or whether it was, just not replicable, I'm
Mm.
not sure. I'm not sure exactly what explains that, but um, but yeah, just wanted to mention that.
Oh yeah, yeah, of course. And I think what we should say as well on this point is that please, no one go and get a like a DNA test or anything like that to
Yeah.
determine what diet they should be on, because we both know
Yeah.
that those aren't backed up by rigorous science.
We're
But
not there yet, but I think we will be someday. I
I
mean,
think
I think
yeah,
the
definitely.
potential is there actually for it to be effective. We just need more data. Um, and the let's see, there was one other point I wanted to make about diet fits. Oh yeah. I do think there is fairly decent evidence that for people with insulin resistance, regardless of how much weight they lose on different diets,
Hmm.
restricting carbohydrate intake is probably not a bad idea for people who are insulin resistant.
Yeah.
Um, just because it helps control elements of the metabolic syndrome.
Hmm.
So things like elevated triglycerides, elevated or low HDL, um, blood pressure, elevated blood pressure, things like that, that are linked with greater health risks. So it's probably not a bad idea on default to at least moderately restrict carbohydrate for people who are very insulin resistant or have the metabolic syndrome,
Hmm.
regardless of the response of their weight.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. And as you said, it's it's just getting people to find something that works for them. But if they're in that state, then especially if they're inactive, restricting carbohydrates we know is a good idea, because they're not necessary for them. Some definitely in terms of vegetables, fiber, phytonutrients from plants, that kind of thing. But the high starchy, high glycemic carbs, they probably definitely need less of, because they're not using the energy. But it's funny, you talked there about how one person will email you and say, I went on low fat but I put on loads of weight, and then I did low carb and I lost weight, and the opposite happens for someone else. It just, the common denominator there is the calorie intake that they're consuming, whether they know that or not. It's something within those foods that are causing them to either over or under consume, which, as you said, can be entirely individual, which in itself is fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, even though that's true, even though it boils down to calories, I think, it's important to acknowledge also that the types of foods that we eat impact our calorie intake. And
Yeah, of
so,
course, yeah, yeah.
you know, when you when someone goes on a low carbohydrate diet and they have success with that with their weight,
Mm.
that means that that was a diet that helped control their calorie intake, usually without them having to explicitly think about calorie intake,
Mm.
just because of how it affects their hunger and their cravings and the number of items on the table and whatever else, and not having like the really bad offenders like ice cream and cookies and things around anymore.
Mm.
Whatever the net effect of that is, it helps control their calorie intake. So I think it does boil down to calories, but not necessarily because people are explicitly thinking about calories.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that again at the event that you spoke at, which I attended, where you said, we know from the research that people can lose weight on junk food. And we know that if they lose weight, their health markers improve, because that is a factor of weight loss. But it's whether or not they can stick to that weight loss while eating junk food. And the research shows that, as you said there, with people, even if they do think about calories, it's the temptations are higher, the hunger is less. The hunger is greater, because the fullness from that diet is less, because you're eating junk food, and it's that combination of sugar and fat, which is so palatable to the brain, that makes you want to eat more of it. So if you include them
Yeah.
in your diet, you're gonna struggle one way or another, even if you're thinking about calories. So it's like, you can, but it's whether should you.
Yeah, that's right. And I remember when Mark Haub, who was the guy who did that experiment,
Yeah.
he's a professor of nutrition. When he first did that experiment, the calorie restricted junk food diet,
Hmm.
it was very challenging for me. That really like caused a, what do you call it? Some internal conflict for me. It was hard for me to understand that. I was like, how could you be eating junk food and losing weight?
Yeah.
But eventually, the more not just losing weight, but well, the weight loss was less challenging, but
The
his,
improvements of health.
yeah, I mean, his blood glucose went down, his LDL went down, his HDL went up, his triglycerides went down. Like anything you want to look at in his health markers was like dramatically improved.
Yeah.
He lost like 25 pounds. And I mean, if you went into your cardiologist or your endocrinologist, he gave you high from his junk diet.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so that initially was really challenging to me, but I did more reading on it, and now it all makes sense. I mean, basically, there's a ton of evidence that not only does calorie intake determine body fatness, but it also determines a lot about your health. It determines your insulin sensitivity to a large degree. It determines your risk of chronic diseases. It determines all of these other blood markers, or I should say, influences all of these other blood markers that are related to disease that we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and as we covered in the presentation I gave at Mac Nutrition, there's just a ton of evidence supporting this, including these enormous years-long RCTs, randomized controlled trials, with actual real diabetes outcomes,
Mm-hmm.
showing that modest weight loss and increases in physical activity greatly reduce the risk of developing type 2 diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a ton of these trials. So like the evidence is absolutely overwhelming. And one of the points I made in my talk was that I think there's a real disconnect between how strong the evidence is and how effectively this message is reaching the public.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So don't try to do it eating junk food. You probably won't succeed.
Yeah.
But it is an illustration of the power of calorie intake to impact metabolism and metabolic health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And I think that's a great way probably to end, is talking about how, you can still eat these foods that are in our environment, but it's whether or not you'll be successful in the long term doing so. And knowing that the whole IIFYM, if it fits your macros approach, has that success with some people because they have a greater flexibility in their diet. Again, they're not, people have this good versus bad food in their head, don't they? And that leads to restriction and binges. So it can help people, I guess, get on an even keel with food. But as you said, depending on your activity levels, depending on your environment, doing so on an ad libitum basis, because no one wants to be tracking calories forever. It's going to be much harder to maintain if you do that for, less than like 5 to 10% of your diet, which I guess is why most people come up with the 90-10 split of nutrient foods versus junk foods.
Yeah, and I support that. And that's what I do in my life too. It's probably more like 95-5, but I mean, all the foods that I talk about being unhealthy, I eat all of those foods, just
Yeah,
not very often.
exactly.
But I do want to acknowledge that there are different types of people, different types of personalities. There are some people who do well with the moderation approach, and there are some people who don't seem to do very well just because those foods push their buttons so hard in their brains that they can lose control really easily just from eating, ice cream or chips or whatever it is once or twice. That might send them into a tailspin that lasts weeks or months. So I think part of, and I'm not a practitioner. I don't work with clients. So this is something that practitioners probably know better than I do. But I think as a practitioner and as a person who's trying to implement these things in your own life, it seems useful to know what type of person you're working with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And you'll then go through the trial and error with that person. And I think for the listeners out there, the way that you can then action this would be to think about what type of person you are with that all or nothing mindset, or whether you're a little bit more gray. And people can adapt. But definitely it may be one of those things where you go completely cold turkey, at least at first, and then gradually introduce like an elimination diet, but for junk food as opposed to food intolerances, and then see how you get on. But no, great. Well, I think we've had a really good discussion there. Obviously, you mentioned your book, The Hungry Brain, for people that would want to go out and read that. But if they wanted to find you anywhere else, where would be the best places for them to go?
Yeah, so my website is stephanguyunet.com, or if you don't want to spell that, it's wholehealthsource.org. And then I'm most active on Twitter, and my
Hmm.
handle is at WHSource.
Okay, yeah. So the handle is the easier to spell of the words as well. Great.
Yeah,
Well, I'll link up those in the show notes anyway,
great.
so people can copy and paste. But once again, thank you for joining me. It's been great.
All right. Thank you.